That is not dead which can eternal lie, and in strange eons even death may die. Happy Halloween, we're doing Cosmic Horror. Of all the horrors, Cosmic is my absolute favorite, and we're going to be talking about how you can world build a Cosmic Horror world, or just add some of it into your story to your character's dismay. Cosmic Horror, of course, has a very strong association with H.P. Lovecraft's works, and going there for a little inspiration isn't bad, but he isn't the end-all be-all, which is nice considering his eccentricities. Cosmic horror, in my mind, is the idea of facing an entity which is so beyond you in capability and understanding that it views you as you may view an ant. And this line of thinking can be carried into all sorts of fun places. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the three main ways you can insert cosmic horror into your world from small to large scale. Normally I'd hit us with the first step right about now, but I'm actually going to start with something that I think applies regardless of how you're incorporating cosmic horror, and that is what your cosmic horrible entity feeds off of. My personal recommendation is to associate it with a theme or an idea of your choice. Cosmic horror is very fun and very scary, but if the Eldritch entity's deal is just that it's evil, it might not be the most interesting thing. Instead, I find a very useful place to start is the 7 deadly sins: lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. In a way, when thinking of these terms, you can almost imagine your hellish entity as a demon with more esoteric powers. Another approach, a mirror to the previous, is to actually use the 7 heavenly virtues and turn them into tragic flaws. These are humility, charity, chastity, gratitude, temperance, patience, and diligence. I mentioned tragic flaws for a reason, for cosmic horrors are at their best when tragic, and a tragic character's flaw should never just be a bad trait, but a good trait turned to evil. Oedipus Rex is the preeminent example. People seem to think his fatal flaw is his pride or hubris, and I mean, it is a character flaw, but it's incorrect to say that that's the key reason that he fell. No, Oedipus's fatal flaw was his love for his people. He wanted so desperately to save them from the plague that it led him down the tragic road that led to his unraveling. You could say, well, of course he loves his people. What else was he gonna do? And I would say, that's the whole point. He was doomed by his very nature, and that's the tragedy. Bet you didn't think we'd be getting literary in a video about spooky tentacle gods, eh? So yeah, that's what I would do. Take a good trait, presumably the one held by the person or people responsible for the rise of your eldritch entity, and make everything about it center on that trait and prey on the presence of that trait in those who come to investigate. So now that brings us to Scale 1, Descent into Madness. A descent into madness is much as traditional cosmic horror tends to be. In some far-off fishing village, some lost estate, your characters discover that there is something horrible lurking just under the surface. Junji Ito's Uzumaki, Darkest Dungeon, and the classic Shadow over Innsmouth are all excellent examples of a descent into madness. Of these, I'm most knowledgeable on Darkest Dungeon. In Darkest Dungeon, you ride into the estate of your ancestor alongside 2 mercenaries who will fight under your name: a crusader named Reynauld and a highwayman named Dismas. You have an encounter on the road where you fight some bandits off before making your way into town. It's decrepit and it's dark, and as you gather your dungeon-delving parties, you begin to uncover the madness that lurks beneath, all the way up until you discover what it is your ancestor dug up beneath the estate that led to this fall into ruin. When working on a descent into madness, you can really go about creating it in 2 ways. Starting with the deepest of secrets and working your way outwards, or starting with the outwardly visible and then discovering for yourself what lurks beneath, much like your characters do. If you do it more as a discovery, my personal recommendation is that as you mentally explore the nuances of this eldritch entity, that you find whatever thing it does that resonates with you the most. Say on a purely cosmetic level, you like the idea of its victims having their eyes glaze over to the point that they look like they have cataracts. Think about that. Cataracts, it leads to the idea of blindness. So then it must become symbolic. What is it they didn't see that led them to falling so? This is yet another reason that your entity should center around a flaw. If it is taking over simply because it's just a really strong old thing, that's kind of boring. It's got to be preying on something. If you start from the core evil and extrapolate it out to how that evil might affect the world, then do just that. Say you chose patience as your heavenly virtue it preys upon. I can easily see how that would lead to its effects on people being a gradual slowing down. At first, visitors caught unaware just think they're very kind, patient, they answer questions, and they forgive mistakes. But eventually, its victims become so patient that they stop moving altogether, leaving behind a ghost town of people frozen in time. Now, doesn't that sound wonderful? The next core thing to think about is, what is its weakness? Why do those who venture forth to investigate this entity not immediately fail? Does it prey on the faithful, or are those who believe insulated by their devotion? Ultimately, cosmic horror is about the raged, blind struggle of the human soul against overwhelming darkness. What is the candle they hold that pushes that darkness back? Say we go back to that patience example, perhaps the impatient, the persevering, even the reckless, might be somewhat insulated from its effects for a time. Perhaps their bull-headed drive to track down and defeat this evil, not to wait for results to come from someone else, is what it would take to get to the bottom of the mystery. Other than that, with things like setting, you can honestly go wild, and that's why I didn't mention it until now. The isolated town or estate is the most straightforward and easy way to justify, but if its effects are subtle, you could even set it in a well-known or heavily populated place. Hell, you could use cosmic horror as a metaphor. Much as the night motifs in Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep hint towards the death of selflessness and heroism in Depression-era Los Angeles, you too can use your cosmic horror for a greater purpose. And don't let anyone ever tell you things like cosmic horror or, detective fiction like The Big Sleep, or fantasy or sci-fi or any other genre is inherently frivolous. Anything can be used to get across meaningful ideas when used correctly. With that, we'll move to scale 2, hanging in the balance. At this scale, your cosmic horror is a known entity in the world as a whole, but there is something that opposes it. It is something of a cosmic battle. I'm leading it with this phrasing because this is actually how my fantasy universe works. While there are dozens of gods across many cultures, ultimately there is a force of creation, the salvation, that stands in opposition to a force of ultimate destruction, the cataclysm. The salvation came first, and it created all that was, and things were pretty good, but the cataclysm always existed, would always come, and its methods were far more sinister. Rather than making anything of its own, it corrupted much of what already was and set the conflicts of the world in motion. And to keep consistent with my advice at the beginning, its deadly sin is greed, its heavenly virtue diligence. It exploits those who are most capable and twists their ambition against them. When working with a cosmic horror that is in opposition to the rest of the world, my main point of advice is that those who know of it should fear it. Those who serve it should be powerful, and yet doomed and cursed. Warhammer Fantasy, 40k, Age of Sigmar, all of those operate at this level with the universal chaos gods. You have Khorne, Lord of Blood and War. Nurgle, Lord of Disease and Death. Tzeentch, Lord of Change and Magic. Slaanesh, Lord of Depravity and Excess. And what do they feed on? Khorne feeds on honor and courage, Nurgle on generosity, Tzeentch on ambition, and Slaanesh on diligence and perfectionism. They are opposed by gods like Sigmar in fantasy, or in 40k by the God Emperor of mankind.
Yes, to the false emperor.
And just between you and me, I'd take Sigmar. But the God Emperor is okay too. What using this kind of scale does is make everything so much more grand, to really simplify it. Not only does every battle between good and evil have the physical ramifications of victory or defeat, but the metaphysical, the spiritual. You aren't only fighting to survive, but for the survival of your very soul. And it's hard to get more dramatic than that. There can be a lot of variation in who actually knows this is the kind of world they're living in. Often knowledge of the Eldritch gods is thought of as being a cognito hazard, so for the average person to know about them could be dangerous. This is more or less true in the Warhammer settings, where people might know there are dark gods, but essentially nothing beyond that. It also adds to the mystery and intrigue of them. If only specialists are brave or studied enough to know about them, they remain elusive, esoteric. The last thing I'll say here is, of course, develop the pantheon that opposes them. And I suppose you could always check out my video on fantasy religions, but I digress. Finally, we'll move to scale 3. It's all over. At this scale, the cosmic gods are present, known, and they have no equals to stand against them. They are the dominant power in the world. There's a reason I call this the It's All Over scale, as generally speaking, things will not be looking good for humanity in these kinds of worlds. Sometimes these are straight up apocalypses, but in others, it's up to people by themselves to last just one more day. Darkest Dungeon 2, though something of a controversial sequel, is a good example of this. That game takes place in something of a purgatory realm. You, the player, are actually the one responsible for the end of the world, and it is up to you to recover your memories of having done so, all while helping those adventurers who helped you in the last game regain their own memories and help save the world. There, the force you have that allows you to survive is hope, represented by a candle. And that transitions well into my main point about worlds where the Eldritch entity is in complete control. Whereas in all cosmic horror you should have a fundamental idea for what the cosmic horror preys on, here there must be a universal, uniting theme that can stand against it. Not just one character's traits, but something omnipresent. Of course, you can go full grimdark and have it such that nothing can stop the end of the world, but otherwise, perhaps hope, or love, or companionship can be harnessed to drive back the darkness. Often the settings themselves in such worlds will end up being fairly soft in their world building, though there may be a fairly specific series of events that has led to the dominance of the cosmic entities. Often you'll be working with just as small a cast of characters as you would in a smaller scale cosmic horror story, as in such a world the sane and the good will be in short supply, to say the least. Most entities the characters encounter will probably be trying to kill or corrupt them. However, referring to an idea from my Apocalypses video, you could also set your cosmic dominant world setting just before the Eldritch entities take over, and have a larger scale version of the descent into madness, where society itself begins to break down and tear itself apart. A good friend of mine is actually working on such a story, and I enjoy the premise because I find it a fair bit more original than your conventional zombie or nuclear apocalypse. Anyway, with that, I think we've about covered cosmic horror. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate you liking and subscribing. Also in recent news, finally actually using the mic because I got a new one. Anyway, happy Halloween, and remember, if you start growing tentacles,
It's